Hey, future APEACE masters.
Ah,
I know you guys are probably like drowning in textbooks right now trying to get ready for that APEACE exam in May, but don't worry because today we are going on a deep dive into ecosystems and energy flow to hopefully make it a little less painful.
yeah, and it's really not just about the test though, right? Understanding how energy moves through these ecosystems is really understanding how life on Earth works.
Okay, so let's start with the basics.
Yeah.
I mean, everybody knows about food chains, right?
hmm
It's like that classic Lion King scene where Mufasa's like explaining the circle of life to Simba, except in real life it's less dramatic.
Yeah, no, standing on Pride Rock.
Right.
It's more about understanding how energy flows from one organism to another,
Right.
and that all starts with the producers.
Producers.
Yeah, these are the organisms like plants and algae that capture sunlight and use it to make energy
Right.
through photosynthesis. They're like the ultimate chefs, right? They're cooking up these delicious meals using only sunlight, water, and carbon dioxide.
And then those meals are enjoyed by consumers. The herbivores,
hmm
the carnivores, we've got the omnivores who like a little bit of everything.
Yep. And each of these levels that we're talking about, producers, primary consumers, secondary consumers, all of that, each of those is called a trophic level. Think of it like a ladder, with the producers forming that solid base, and each level after that kind of climbs up higher.
But it can get a little messy too,
Right.
right? Because like any good party, there are always some party crashers who show up to clean up the leftovers.
Yeah, the decomposers, detritivores, and scavengers.
They are the ones who keep the party going.
Right.
Okay, so break it down for me.
Right.
What is the difference between like a detritivore and a decomposer? I mean, they both deal with dead stuff, right?
Right. They both have the super important job of breaking down that organic matter, and they're recycling those nutrients right back into the ecosystem. But there's a key difference.
Okay.
Detritivores, like our friend the earthworm, they actually consume that dead stuff. They're like tiny little garbage disposals.
So they're like the vacuum cleaners.
Exactly. Decomposers, on the other hand, they're working on a much smaller scale. These are the bacteria and fungi that break down that organic matter chemically, releasing enzymes and stuff that break down the complex molecules into simple nutrients for plants to take up.
So they are like the ultimate recyclers.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've got the producers who are making the food,
Right.
consumers eating it, the cleanup crew tidying up afterward. But how does energy actually move through all of this? Because it's not like a perfect handoff, right?
Right. And that's where those laws of thermodynamics come into play.
Oh, yeah.
Energy cannot be created or destroyed, but it can totally change forms, and some of that energy is lost as heat during those changes.
So it's kind of like every time the energy is transferred from one level to the next, you lose a little bit along the way, like a leaky bucket.
A leaky bucket, yep. And that leaky bucket phenomenon brings us to our next important concept, ecological efficiency,
Ecological efficiency.
which basically measures how much energy from one trophic level actually makes it to the next level.
And I have a feeling it's not very efficient.
Well, you are right about that. On average, only about 10% of the energy makes it from one trophic level to the next.
Why?
That's our famous 10% rule. So, if a plant has 100 units of energy, the grasshopper that eats it is only going to get 10 of those units.
Right.
And then the robin that comes along and eats that grasshopper
Yeah.
gets even less, only 1 unit of energy.
Wow, that's a pretty steep discount, like going to a store and everything's 90% off,
Yeah.
but only if you're the next person in line.
Yeah, exactly. And all that energy loss, it really affects how ecosystems are structured.
Right.
Think about it.
Oh.
Only 10% of that energy makes it to the next level. So that means there's way less energy to support those organisms at the higher trophic levels.
So that's why there's way more plants than herbivores and way more herbivores than carnivores.
Exactly. And we can actually see this represented visually in what we call trophic pyramids.
Trophic pyramids.
Yeah, and these pyramids can show us the decrease in biomass, energy or number of organisms at each level. Like you have this wide base of the pyramid, right?
Uh-huh.
That's the producers, packed with all that energy from the sun. And then as you go up the pyramid to the consumers, it gets narrower and narrower.
Oh, so it's like the pyramid scheme of nature?
Well, it's not really a scheme,
Right.
but it definitely shows how energy is limiting how many organisms can exist at those higher trophic levels.
Right, right.
And this actually brings us to another really important point that I know comes up a lot on the APS exam.
Oh, okay.
It's the exceptions to the 10% rule.
The exceptions.
Yeah, because 10% is a good average to think about.
Okay.
The actual amount of energy transferred can change, like depending on what kind of ecosystem you're talking about, what types of organisms are involved, stuff like that.
So it's not like a hard and fast rule.
Not a hard and fast rule, so just keep that in mind.
Okay, good to know. Is there anything else about the 10% rule that we should keep in mind for the APS test?
Yeah. This is super important. Remember that this energy loss, it has huge implications for conservation, too.
Oh, okay.
Like if you're trying to protect a top predator, like a wolf or a tiger,
Right.
you got to think about how much energy it actually takes to support that whole population.
Hmm.
We have to think about protecting that whole food web, not just one single species at the top,
It all comes back to the ecosystem.
the whole ecosystem.
Okay, so we've talked about these food chains and how energy flows through them. But in the real world, it's rarely that simple, is it?
Nope. Ecosystems are more like, this giant web of interactions, multiple food chains all woven together, and that's what we call a food web.
A food web.
Mm.
Okay, so why is it important to think about a food web instead of just a simple food chain?
Well, because the food web shows us how changes in one part of an ecosystem can affect the whole thing. Imagine like a spider web, right? You
Yeah.
tug on one strand
Right.
and the whole web vibrates.
Yeah.
So if one population changes, it can totally have these like cascading effects on all the other populations.
Yeah, that makes sense. Can you give me an example?
Sure, this is a classic example. The wolves in Yellowstone.
Oh, yeah, Yellowstone.
Right. When they took wolves out of the park,
Okay.
the elk population, it just exploded.
Too many elk.
Way too many. And they were eating everything.
Yeah.
Like overgrazing, which damaged a bunch of plants, and that ended up hurting other species too, like the beavers and songbirds.
So the wolves were keeping those elk in check.
Exactly. And when they put the wolves back in, they started to control the elk population again. The vegetation recovered, and that had this ripple effect that actually ended up helping out a lot of other species.
Wow, that's really interesting. It sounds like these feedback loops, they can be good or bad.
You got it. Positive feedback loops make that initial change even bigger, and that can make things unstable.
Okay.
Like, say you've got an invasive species that gets into an ecosystem, right?
Uh-huh.
No natural predators.
Yeah.
Its population just explodes, and that messes up the balance even more.
So it's kind of like a runaway train.
It is a runaway train, and that's why they can be kind of a problem in ecosystems.
Right.
Now, negative feedback loops, those are more like a thermostat,
Okay.
bringing the system back into balance. So the wolves in Yellowstone, that was a negative feedback loop.
Bringing it all back to equilibrium.
Right.
Okay, so I guess it's not really about good or bad. It's just about how they affect the ecosystem.
Right.
And speaking of these feedback loops keeping things stable, are there other types of feedback loops out there?
Yeah, tons of them. They can get pretty complicated too, but I think the main thing to remember is that feedback loops are everywhere.
Right.
And if you can understand them, you can really start to predict how ecosystems might respond to changes.
Like climate change or habitat loss.
Exactly.
All that stuff.
Okay, so before we wrap up this deep dive,
Yeah.
let's do like a quick review of everything we've talked about today. We started with the basics, right?
Right.
Food chains and those trophic levels.
Yeah, those are the building blocks
Yeah.
of any ecosystem. Then we talked about how energy flows from the producers to the consumers.
Right. And how some energy is lost.
With the leaky bucket,
With the leaky bucket, our 10% rule.
the 10% rule. And then we talked about the decomposers and the detritivores, the cleanup crew,
Our unsung heroes.
the ones who keep the party going,
Keeping the party going.
recycling all those nutrients. And then we moved on to the food webs,
Yeah.
where everything's all connected.
Everything's connected. Multiple food chains, all intertwined.
And to wrap things up, we talked about those feedback loops,
Yes.
how changes in one part of the web can really affect the whole thing.
Yeah, and those feedback loops, they're not just some abstract idea. They actually matter.
Right.
They have these real-world implications for conservation. So understanding them can really help us protect this delicate balance of life.
Absolutely. Well, there you have it, future APES exam champions. Hopefully, you're feeling a little more confident about tackling those ecosystem questions on the exam. Remember, it's not just about memorizing definitions. It's about really understanding how all of these concepts work together to create this amazing web of life. Good luck with your studies, and keep on exploring.